Hi everybody, and welcome to our very first small group session in our series 10 Values that Build Strong Families. I want to talk a little bit today about the 10 Commandments, which is what those 10 values are. We began on Sunday looking at how important the foundation is that we put God first in our life. But I just want to say a few things about the whole idea of the 10 Commandments. A lot of times when you hear that term, 10 Commandments, you have pictures in your mind of, well, that's the rules that God has to mess up my life or to restrict me or whatever. Today I'd like us to look at 3 facts about the 10 Commandments that will help clarify and correct some of those ideas. And the first is this: why did God give us the 10 Commandments in the first place? And your first statement on your outline says this. It says, God has given us the 10 Commandments to teach us how to love. The reason He gave us these 10 guidelines, these 10 instructions, these 10 commandments, these 10 values, is so that we would know how to love. The 10 Commandments are not a job description of how to get into God's family. Often I've talked to people and I've asked them the question, what do you think you'd say to God if He said to you, why should I let you into heaven? And often the answer that we get, and it's a logical answer from our human perspective, is, well, I try to live by the 10 Commandments. I try to do the best I can. And the reality is none of us can do it perfectly. And so that's not how you get into God's family. You get into God's family by His grace and by His mercy. He welcomes you, not because you earned it or you obeyed a bunch of rules. So what are the 10 Commandments for? Well, it's simply this. The 10 Commandments are instructions on how to love once you're in God's family. They teach us the rules of how do you relate to God and how do you relate to one another. Every family has rules. Our family has rules that we live by. Why? So that our relationship will be smooth and good. And when those rules are broken, that's when there's tension in the family. And God has given us these instructions, these commandments, so that we can learn how to live effectively in relationship to Him and to others. In fact, if you were to say what is the primary rule that God has when it comes to the 10 Commandments, it's this. It's to love. It's to love Him and to love others. One day Jesus Himself was asked by someone, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus' answer says, He said this. He said, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. And He said that's the first and greatest commandment. But then He said there's a second, which is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The Apostle Paul talked about this same thing. He said in Romans, he said, owe nothing to anyone, don't be obliged to anyone, except for your obligation to love one another. If you love your neighbor, you fulfill the requirements of God's law. God's law, the 10 Commandments, the instructions that He's given us, it's to teach us how to love. The second thing that you need to note and that we need to see here is this, that living by the 10 Commandments results in healthy relationships. You know, everybody wants to have healthy relationships, but it's interesting. This week I was actually looking online at one of the talks, the TED Talks. And if you're interested, go onto Google and look up The Good Life TED Talks. The Good Life TED Talks. If you look at that, it's about a 20-minute video. And on there, the fellow that's speaking, he's talking about how do you have the good life? How do you have happiness? And the interesting thing was this. He said very rarely can you really get a picture of someone's entire life. You know, when you ask people what makes you happy, well, they look at that segment of their life where they're living right at that moment. But the interesting thing is this. At Harvard University, in 1938, about 75 or so years ago, they did a study. They began a study with 724 men. Half of them were college graduates from Harvard, and the other half were from a very poor district in the city of Boston. And they tracked every single one of those men beginning back in 1938 up to the present time. And today there's still about 60 of those men living. And every year they sent them a survey asking them about what makes them happy. You know what's interesting? If you ask millennials, the young adults today, what is it that makes you happy? What is it that's going to give you the good life? 80% of millennials that are asked that question say money. My goal is to have money. It's the most sought after thing. And of that number, they said 50% of them, they say the second thing they're after is fame. They want to be famous and they want to have money. Do you know, when they did this study with the 724 men and tracked them for 75 years, every single one of them, it came up at the end of their life. You know what the source of happiness was? Relationships. Relationships. And that's why God says relationships are so important. Learning to love Him and learning to love others. And so the Ten Commandments is a guideline, it's instructions on how to have healthy relationships. And so if you want to have healthy relationships in your family, you need to live by these instructions that God has given us. The third thing I'd like to note is this. Yes, relationships give us healthy families, they give us happiness, but to have good relationships, it always involves a choice. Always. You always choose how you're going to live. I'd like to just read this passage in Joshua. It says this, and Joshua was leading the nation of Israel into the promised land that God had promised them. And they had come out of Egypt, and they had a long history of wandering around in the desert. And now they're about to go into the promised land. And Joshua says this. He says, "Now fear the Lord and serve Him with all faithfulness." And then he says, "Throw away the gods your forefathers worshipped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourself this day whom you will serve." In other words, he's saying this. God wants to be first in your life. But if that seems undesirable to you, he's telling them, choose today what you're going to do. Who are you going to serve? And he says, whether the gods of your forefathers served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, which was another people group back then, in whose land you're living. He says, you can, if you want, you can choose to have other gods, and you don't need to acknowledge God as first place in your life. He says, but as for me and my household, in other words, for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. And that's the question that every single one of us is faced with. Will we choose to give God first place in our life? Now, I'd just like to point out one thing. When we talk about choosing to let God have first place in our life, we're not making Him first place. We're not putting Him in a position. He's already in first place. The question is, will we recognize it? You see, the starting place is choosing to recognize that God is the Lord. He is the CEO. He is the boss of the universe. And the question is, will you give Him first place in every area of your life and acknowledge that He's in first place? In making that choice, you're not giving God authority. You're not giving Him position. He already has authority, and He already has position. He's the supreme authority. But He gives you the choice. Will you acknowledge that fact and live according to that fact in your life? And He promises that if you will do that, your life will go well with Him. It doesn't mean you won't have troubles. Doesn't mean you won't have problems. And as we go into 2016, there's all kinds of challenges that face us. But He said, if you will live according to these values and give me first place in your life, it will go well with you, and I will take you through those situations. All right, we'll take your sheets now and take some time to look at the questions that you have to discuss this whole question of putting God first in your life. And can I encourage you to do this? As you look at the questions, be honest with each other. Don't be afraid to open up, and don't be afraid to pray for one another and support one another as we all work together to build strong, healthy families. So God bless you, and we'll see you next week.